The pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
Four simple words. Together, they inspire a nation. They helped a population grow. They changed through those words. I have a dream. When those few words are pronounced, anyone think of Martin Luther King and his fight against segregation. I have a dream speech was one of the greatest. The way it was said, the person who said it, the historical context in which the speech was said and afterwards, the results and consequence of the speech. All this together and more made this speech incredible and one we're all gonna remember even 100 years from now.
Martin Luther King was born January 5, 1929 in Atlanta. His father was a pastor in a church. Martin Luther King became an American Baptist minister. Martin Luther was also a very important activist and one of the most visible spokesperson and leader of the civil rights movement from 1954 through 1968. This man played a major role in the advancement of civil rights, using the tactic of nonviolence and civil disobedience based on his Christian beliefs and inspired by the nonviolence activist Mahatma Gandhi. His career as an activist began in 1955 when a woman was arrested for refusing to give her seat to a white man in the bus. Martin Luther King was the leader of an organization who boycotted the bus company. He was an activist against segregation and through different speeches and manifestations, he fights all his life for black people's rights. Martin Luther King was also very involved in the opposition of the United States in the Vietnam War. He was a very powerful and involved man, and he received a lot of prizes for his actions and manifestations. In 1964, Martin Luther King received the Nobel Peace Prize for his battle against racial inequalities without using violence. He also received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In the wake of this speech and march, King was named Man of the Year by Time magazine for 1963. He delivered his most famous speech, I Have a Dream, this year, who had major consequences in the progress of civil rights.
Consequently, in his speech, he denounced various things concerning black people living in a poor life, in bad conditions, concerning segregation. 100 years before King's speech was made in Washington, D.C. in front of the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington for Jobs and Liberty, the slavery in America was abolished.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination.
100 years from August 28, 1963, exactly, the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. It was ordered on January 1, 1863 by the President Abraham Lincoln. Also, it was a federal legal status to accord freedom to more than 3 million people who were enslaved in the designated areas in the South. Notably, during the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, the United States were divided into the North and the South. The North wanted to abolish slavery and the South wanted to continue doing it. Accordingly, the North won and it resulted with the dissolution of the Confederate States, the U.S. territorial integrity preserved, the beginning of the Reconstruction era, and the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Concerning this, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed by the Senate on April 8, 1864, and it was the abolition of slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution is Section 1. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. However, even if the slavery was not tolerated anymore, segregation was. Moreover, segregation is the enforced separation of different racial groups in a country, community, or establishment. It appears in restaurants, bathrooms, water fountains, schools, cinemas, bus, hotels, houses, churches, neighborhoods, etc. Black people had less rights and were treated in those situations as animals or not even as persons. They were treated as the unclean and inferior race, and the white were the dominant race over all the other ones. Not only black people were touched by segregation, but Latinos, Mexican, anyone who wasn't white. In a like manner, that was the reason and the major aspect of Martin Luther King's speech. He was fighting for the civil rights, and he wasn't alone. That is because of the African American Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968. This movement was characterized because of the many riots in black communities, underground support from the white community. It also was characterized because of the group's strategies, campaigns of civil resistance, nonviolent protests, civil disobedience, social movements that had as goal to end the legalized discrimination laws and racial segregation. It produced crisis situation and productive discussion between the activists and the government. It pushed the federal, state, and local governments, and also the businesses and communities to respond to the crisis the activists created, so they could see the inequities faced by African Americans. In brief, King represented all of them, being what they wanted, what they needed, a spokesperson that could make a change.
Millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity.
Furthermore, the word choice, the figurative language, and the rhetoric technique King used had a large impact in the audience. He was using voice merging, a prophetic voice, and he did a dynamic spectacle. The way he spoke to the audience, like he was singing. The pause in the right time, the voice merging, and the important part of his speech, etc.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious races, with its governor.
Also, many rhetoric techniques can be used in oratory, like enumeration, rhythm, repetition, etc. But the real names of the techniques he used was alliteration, anadilopsis, anaphora, assonance, and more. The one he used the most was anaphora, the repetition of a word or a group of words in the beginning of successive sentences or lines. Indeed, he used the group of words I have a dream, let freedom ring, we can never be satisfied, 100 years later, go back to, and the word together when doing anaphoras. Anaphoras made a greater impact in his speech. The repetition of his words really made an emphasis and transferred the passion of King for his message to the audience.
The speech had incredible consequences on the civil rights and social status of black people. The speech helped ending the segregation in the United States. Martin Luther King had a specific vision of the society where races do not influence how people were treated or how they are living their lives. His dream was to make a United States an equal place for everyone. Even if Black people's rights had made a gigantic step since the last decades, some events in the news still remind us that racial equality is not totally reached. Police brutality with Afro-American population is still frequent. The 3rd March 1991, Rodney King, an African-American taxi driver, was victim of police brutality. The aggression was recorded and published through internet, and Rodney King became a symbol for the fight against police brutality and discrimination. The March on Washington puts pressure on the actual government to change the system. The march and the speech had really big consequences, and the Kennedy government proposed a major project, the Civil Rights Act, the 3rd of July 1964. The declaration made discrimination based on the color of the skin, the sex, the religion, or nationality illegal. The declaration also banned segregation in hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments. The declaration was originally made to defend Afro-American people. This was a big step for civil rights and the ending of racial segregation. The Civil Rights Act was not the only declaration created because of the African American civil rights movement. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibits racial discrimination in voting. The act secured minorities' voting rights in the states with an historic underrepresentation of minorities as voters. A final declaration ending all forms of segregation in the United States had been signed in 1968. The Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act. This act was a accumulation of civil rights regarding housing discrimination in the United States. The act was approved 1 week after the assassination of Martin Luther King. All those declarations are direct or indirect positive consequences of Martin Luther King's speech and of the African civil rights movement. Sadly, Martin Luther King did not see the final achievement of his dream. He was shot the April 4th, 1968 by James Earl Ray. He was frequently receiving death threats due to his important and major role in the fight for racial equality. A lot of conspiracy theories floats around Martin Luther King's death, involving the USA government, the mafia, and the local police. After John Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King told his wife, "This is what is going to happen to me also. I keep telling you, this is a sick society." Martin Luther King's funeral regrouped 300,000 people. During his life, Martin Luther King succeeded his career as an activist for the civil rights movement. His speech, "I Have a Dream," has marked the spirits and will eternally be an historic reference of the fights of equal civil rights. He was a non-violent, educated, and well-spoken man. He was one of the first leaders of the Afro-American population, almost unanimously respected and admired. This is why Martin Luther King will always stay an iconic figure of leadership for the progress of civil rights.